us remotely via Microsoft Teams. Members of the board joining us remotely should keep their cameras on at all times, but switch their microphones off until they wish to speak. All other remote participants should have their cameras and microphones switched off during the meeting unless they are speaking. All remote participants will be asked to speak at the appropriate time. If members and officers in the chamber could ensure that their microphones are at the correct height, and when speaking into them, you should speak directly into them, this will assist with the sound quality for those joining on Teams. Again, there is no alarm test scheduled today, so if the klaxon goes off in the chamber, we should make our way to the exit through the door from which you came, down the main staircase and out the front reception. We will head to the Arts Centre and we will wait until clearance is given to return. I will, at that point, email all those on Teams to rejoin the meeting at the appropriate time. I'll ask Gogo now to start the recording, and then I'll undertake a roll call. Councillor John Crawley.
Present.
Councillor Hutchison. Not yet. He was, yeah, he's maybe not, but I'll keep an eye on that. Dr. Bochel.
Yeah.
Councillor Cox.
Present. Yeah.
Thank you. Councillor Davidson.
Present.
We've got Councillor Kate Blake substituting for Sandra MacDonald.
Present.
Councillor Radley.
Present.
Councillor Reid.
Present.
Councillor Yule.
Present.
And I believe Councillor McClellan will be coming in as a substitute at 4 o'clock because you've got another meeting.
Yeah, I've got a better offer.
Colin Allenach.
Present.
Jerry Donald.
Present.
And Ian Ross.
Present.
Thank you.
Yeah, please read out the apologies.
Sorry, I've got another couple officer apologies. Alan Wood has sent us apologies, and we've got Richard McKenzie online. I've also, Ewan Wallace can't make the meeting today, and we've got Martin Hall in the chamber today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to anyone got declaration of interests? And that we all agree the transparency statement. Okay. Moving on to approval of the minute of the board meeting on the 8th of December 22. Is that approved? Okay, no, nothing there. We'll move on to the number 3, budget matters. That's Rab.
No, Ellis Stott from Aberdeenshire Council Finance, I think, is online. I see her picture coming up. So if I could hand over to Ella to present this, thanks.
Thank you, Rob. Right, this budget matter report provides an update on the Nestrans budget monitoring for 22-23 and forecast outcome position. Appendix 1 details the summary position as at the end of January, showing expenditure to date of 1.921 million. This information is before virements and carry forwards. Now I'd like to take this opportunity to correct some figures under the income section in the capital grant and use of balance. The actuals to January 23 for capital grant should read 2.058 million, resulting in a year-to-date operating surplus of 1.502 million. The forecast should read 2.931 million, resulting in an operating surplus of 272,620 pounds. A corrected version is available for circulation on request. Appendix 2 sets out a list of virements proposed for the remaining financial year, which need to be approved. A number of projects within the 22-23 budget will not be delivered this financial year due to several reasons, as explained within the report. Appendix 3 details the funding to be carried forward into 23-24 to the sum of 2.978 million. A further extension has been granted for pensions discretion policy, and Aberdeenshire Council is hoping to have the matter completed by the end of March. There's still no claims made in the current financial year in relation to the Strategic Transport Fund. The current position is £484,594. There are 5 recommendations for the board to approve. 1 is note the monitoring position and forecast presented in Appendix 1. 2, approve the environment set out in Appendix 2. 3, approve the continuation of funding to the next financial year to complete approved projects presented in Appendix 3. 4, note the updates on the pensions discretions policy. And 5, note the Strategic Transport Fund position. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you for that report. Is there any questions? That's like.
Thank you, convener. I was interested in, so in Appendix 1, we're showing quite an underspend in a number of the active travel projects. So you're forecasting an underspend of almost £1 million. And there's also the active travel development officer grant, shows that we only got 15k of the 100k has been spent. And I would be keen to understand why that's the case.
Chair, can I? Yeah, sorry, Rob, you go.
Rob.
Thanks, Chair. And there has been, it's been a difficult year in terms of expenditure, and there are a number of projects which we rely on partners, particularly the 2 councils, to deliver with us, but through our funding opportunities. We have made some progress now on reviewing our active travel action plan, and we are hoping to be able to spend some of that funding before the end of the financial year. We have been working with partners to try and ensure that we've got a way forward, a robust proposal before we would commit to spending that money. But in terms of the underspend, much of that is now committed, and we are hoping that can be delivered certainly in the coming financial year, but as tenuously as we can.
Glenn.
I had 2 questions. One's been asked already, so this will shorten it. The second question is, it's with regards to the non-core active travel plan, page 15, Appendix 2. So if I just jump to it, it's with £30,000 there. So it says Aberdeen City Council has been unable to allocate the resource to this. I take it that's human resources or officer time for it. So are we going to carry this forward? And has it been has a dedicated officer been allocated to it, or are we going to look at external? Because this actually needs to be delivered.
Yeah, we are looking at bringing in external people to support us, but in partnership with the councils. So both Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen City Councils working with ourselves to try and bring this priority project forward. Yeah.
Okay, I don't see. Sorry, Councillor Blake.
Sorry, I was actually going to ask that question as well about the non-core paths, so that's helpful. I was also wondering about the RTP active travel grant, because it says that up to January we'd spent 92k of the 640k budget, but we're forecasting that we are going to spend the 640k by the end of the financial year. Is that correct? Have I picked that up correctly? And I do have one more question.
Is that Rab?
I can answer that, Chair.
Sorry.
The 92k is what's been physically spent to date, and I'm still confident that to break that figure down, 240k has been spent already on installation and will be spent on fabrication of bridges for the Fermanagh Way. £40,000 has been commissioned for the core path survey and for Martin. £300,000 has been partly spent and will be spent before year end on the bike recycling reuse project, and 47k has been commissioned and work has begun on the quiet road network. So I'm still confident that we'll spend all of our 640k.
Dave, thanks. Thanks for that. I'll take it you'll be going more into that on 6.2 when you've done that. Yeah. Sorry, Councillor Blake.
Sorry, yes, there was one more question. So on page 17, it mentions about the active travel network development, the 50k. Now, obviously, this was at City Growth and Resources, Finance and Resources Committee in September. There was discussion about, well, there was an action around the development of the active travel network. Is this the same piece of work, or is it a different piece of work? Will the two councils work together to maximise efficiencies on this?
Bring in Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Councillor and Chair. We've been working up a joint proposal with the two councils and Nestrans to pool the resources that we do have and put out a combined study such that we have a single consultant looking seamlessly at the city and the Shire and the strategic network interfaces around that. Funding is set aside for that, and we're just going through that. We're not quite at the point of getting it out into the procurement portal just yet, but we're on the verge of doing that. Unfortunately, a bit of COVID has delayed matters, but that is definitely the intention, and that's what we have been working through with our partners to make sure that we get that commission correct for each of the partners to make sure it meets all their needs.
Like coming.
Sorry, I was just wanting to make a slight clarification on the question about the core pass asset management plan on page 15 that you asked about. That's actually a environment this year because Aberdeen City Council didn't have the resource to take it forward. So that appendix is actually wiring the money to another project. So it's not going to be funded by Nestrans at this point. The core pass study has been done and there's priority have been identified for improvements, and there is money in the proposed budget next year to take forward some of them, but the general overall pass asset management plan that the City Council had asked Nestrans for funding to create, they didn't have an officer to build on it at this stage. It's not to say that it won't happen next year, but it just hasn't. They haven't asked Nestrans for funding to do that. So that appendix on page 15 is actually environments that's moving the money elsewhere. So it's not part of the proposals for next year with Nestrans funding. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions. Oh, sorry, Councillor Reid.
Sorry, it's not actually coming back at that point, but thank you very much for that. It's actually on Councillor Blake's question about the active travel network development. Since I joined Nestrans, I've been banging on about basically Shire meeting the city. And is this something that the consultant's going to be looking at? Because this is something that we really need to get moving on.
Certainly, I recall the report that I brought up in November, Councillor Reid, which we talked through each of the routes and each of the issues on this one, and I think the key element there is that integration across the city and Shire on the strategic routes, as well as what's happening in the Shire's towns, but also how we can create that network within the communities and the linkages within the city as well. So that's what we've been working towards to make sure we get a brief that captures that going forward.
Yes. Ian Ross, please.
Thanks, Chair. It's understandable that the difficulties which the directors alluded to have held back expenditure in the current year. but with the best will in the world, we're pretty close to the end of the financial year. So I think it would be quite important to get some positive steps in place so that as we go into the next financial year and not too far into it, we know how we're going to catch up with the expenditure, which has fallen quite significantly behind. It's going to be difficult not to have quite a lot of expenditure which doesn't get through before the 31st of March. So rather than have an ongoing situation which just piles up again, I think that's something that should be looked at in a particular way before we go too far into 2023, 2024.
Brad?
Yeah, certainly take that point. We are trying to progress some of these projects. Some of them can be delivered, over the next coming months. Others will, by necessity, roll forward into future years. As I say, we are dependent on external partners often to be delivering on some of these, but there are others that we are in a position, as John says, to deliver fairly short term. So the work has been done. Bridges have been purchased, for example, and it's now about getting them implemented. We'll obviously work with external partners like Nestrans as well. And we need to put an awful lot of ducks in a row. And we're very close, I think, in some of the projects to getting to the point where they can be delivered. So, but yes, we'll bring back reports on progress as appropriate.
Okay, I see no other questions. So we, to approve the recommendations 1 to 5, if everyone's happy with that. Okay, thank you. We now move on to 3.2, budget proposals for 23-24 and the 3-year indicative plan, and it's going to be Jenny.
Thank you, Chair. This report asks the board to approve budgets for next financial year, subject, of course, to the anticipated funding levels being confirmed. And the board is also asked to approve a new 3-year strategic investment programme of works. The budget proposals for next financial year have been prepared on the basis that funding levels from both councils and the Scottish Government will be retained at current levels, but the proposed budgets might require further amendment by the board when the actual allocations are confirmed after the councils have set their budgets in March and once an offer of grant has been received from the Scottish Government. The report also notes the grant offered by Pass for All towards the comprehensive travel survey that can continue to be claimed into next financial year, and that it's understood that the £100,000 a grant that's normally received via Nestrans as a result of employing an active travel development officer will instead be included within any regional transport partnership active travel grant next year. Suggestions have been submitted to the Scottish Government for consideration for this grant and for a new active travel transformation fund, and there is a separate report on the agenda with more information on this. But details of any grant offers that are received throughout the year will be included within a Budget Matters report to a future board. Nestrans has worked with officers from both councils to develop budget proposals, and the proposed coordination and project revenue development budget is presented in Appendix 1 and totals just over 1.2 million. It covers the running cost of Nestrans along with non-core costs that are presented under the headings of the various action plans and also some of the headings for actions and priorities within the regional transport strategy. The previously approved 3-year programme of works was taken as a start point when preparing the strategic investment programme for 23-24 that's presented in Appendix 2. The pink-blue shading used within the appendix represents the local authority delivering each project, with pink denoting Aberdeen City Council and blue denoting Aberdeenshire Council. As mentioned, the proposed budget anticipates that council allocations will be continued at previous year's levels to give funding next year at 2.467 million. It also shows the funding from the current financial year that has just been requested in the previous budget report for continuation into 23-24. And given that this has been agreed, it will bring the total available funding next year to just under 5.3 million. Details on the individual proposed projects are given in Appendix 2, and a summary of the spend against the various themes within the regional transport strategy is given in the covering report. As regional transport partnerships can now hold a general fund reserve, the 3-year plan covering the period up to the end of 25-26 was updated and is presented in Appendix 3 with a summary in the covering report. It also assumes a continuation of funding from the councils at the same level as in recent years, but it's not an agreed spending plan as it will be subject to future budget agreements. But it does, however, indicate the potential profiling of expenditure based on current estimated costs and timescales, and shows a general programme of works that can be considered as a basis for preparing annual budgets up to 2026. So the board has been asked to approve the coordination and project development budget and the strategic investment programme for next financial year. It's detailed in Appendices 1 and 2, subject to anticipated funding levels being confirmed and making any appropriate adjustments following the board's consideration. To note the potential additional funding for active travel schemes through the Scottish Government RTP Active Travel Grant and Active Travel Transformation Fund, and to approve the general 3-year programme of works as detailed in Appendix 3 as a basis for future year annual budgets. And I'm happy to try and answer any questions on this report. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Is there any questions? Okay, I don't see any questions on that. So can we go for recommendations 1, 2 and 3 and accept them? Thank you. We move on to 4.1, Director's Report, and that'll be Rab. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. I think I've worked out how the camera works and the microphone works now. After 2 hours or so. Apologies for previous misdemeanors. Item 4.1 is the Director's Report on liaison between the partnerships with the Scottish Government and others. I've included 2 draft minutes as appendices, one for the Health and Transport Action Plan Steering Group, which took place on the 28th of November, and one for the Bus Alliance Steering Group, which took place on the 1st of December. I think they were both reported verbally to the last meeting of the board, but at that point in time there wasn't a formal minute for sharing with you. So they're there for members' information primarily, and any questions if anything's arising. We have had a significant number of meetings over the period since the last board meeting. And maybe a couple, if I could pull them out as of particular significance. The chair and myself were down in Edinburgh for a meeting of the 7 regional transport partner chairs with Jenny Gilruth, the Transport Minister, and her staff. And I thought it was a really useful meeting, primarily focusing on issues around buses, but the Minister was very open to discussion on a range of matters. On 25th of January, we held a business briefing in the Leonardo Hotel on Aberdeen Rapid Transit. So I think members are now all aware of the progress that's being made on that project, but it was good to have bus companies, business operators, SCDI, Visit Scotland and others in the room, and very much about raising awareness and giving the opportunity for business members to ask questions and get into dialogue about that project. The other one I was going to mention was that on Thursday of last week, we held a meeting of the North East Transport Consultative Forum. The forum is a range of, I think, almost 100 stakeholders who get invited from all sectors, whether it's community organisations, disability equity partnership, transport operators, economic interests and environmental groups, to try and ensure that we're touching on and listening to all of the diverse range of views around transport in the North East. It has been mentioned that we've currently commissioned some work on the impact of the government's target for traffic reduction by 20% by the year 2030. And we particularly want to think about how that might look in a region like the northeast of Scotland. And we felt it was important to give stakeholders the opportunity to contribute to that piece of work with the consultants that are doing it for us. It's another one that we would hope to report to the April board, but I just wanted to mention that that had taken place. Some members were able to come along, and I appreciate that. There's also a list of meetings coming up between now and the next board meeting in April. But other than that, I'm happy to take any comments or questions on the report, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Rab. I don't see any questions there. So we'll move to the recommendation 1, note progress on liaison arrangements with other RTP, Scottish Government and others, and the arrangements for further meetings. That's all accepted. So we'll now move on to 4.2, which is Regional Transport Strategy 2040, the annual monitoring report, and that's Barab.
Thank you, Chair. We have always reported annually on a number of indicators to the board. With the approval of the new regional transport strategy in November of 2021, we changed the style and the indicators that we report. We now have a report in front of you, which is the first monitoring report following last year's baseline report. And the way we've set it out is that there are targets, aims against each of the 20 indicators, and they reflect the 6 key areas and priorities within the regional transport strategy. I've pulled together a figure where I can to give an indication of how things have changed in the year or so since we last reported. But there are a number that I was unable to get any information on. So there has been no Scottish household survey done since the pandemic. So no survey done in 2020, 21 or 22. And similarly, no satisfaction of bus users survey done in that time period. So I think there are 3 indicators that I've not been able to update for the board. And I think we maybe will think about how we can get data in these areas if there is not to be future annual information available in a public domain. Of the 20 indicators, I think there are another 6 which have had very little change since last year. But there are probably 9 which have seen significant progress. Obviously, I need to caution that COVID has had a huge impact on elements like reducing the amount of car travel across the region, because it's 2020 and 2021 figures that we're reporting. But there are also others that I think are really heartening and really worthwhile in bringing to your attention. And in particular, those are the sections under casualty reduction, a reduction in the number of fatalities in road traffic collisions, a reduction in the number of injuries of all severities, and I think particularly pleasing to see a reduction in the number of pedestrians killed and seriously injured and the number of cyclists killed or seriously injured. I think it was always a concern that as we encourage a mode shift to walking and cycling, that potentially there could be an impact in terms of more casualties in these areas. But we know that there has been an increase in cycling since the pandemic, but actually the number of cyclists killed and seriously injured in collisions in the northeast was the lowest that has been recorded. There are other areas like reducing concentrations of particulate matter, moving towards net zero carbon emissions, and with the opening of Kintore Station, an improvement in the accessibility to the rail service. There are, however, 2 areas which I've marked in pink in my notes, and they're probably what we would describe as moving in the wrong direction. And they are firstly bus travel times. So indicator 1B in the report. So bus travel times are taking longer across the region in the way that we take sample surveys. And the other one is 6B, a lessening dependence on car travel. So car travel is becoming a higher proportion of trips, whereas there is a target to try and move in the other direction. So a lot of information in, I think it's about a 20-page report, 20 indicators. Hopefully the graphs make it quite easy to pick up on the key trends, but I'm quite happy to take any comments from members or answer any questions if I can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Isabel.
Yeah, it's not entirely connected to this, but it does fall under the same sort of banner. What is there ever any data collected during winter weather about casualties? So car accidents in winter and pedestrian cycles, etc., and the cost of that to health and to local authorities, you know, and to the system as a whole. And it's becoming more and more topical at the moment, that sort of information, and I think some places do collect it, but I'm not aware that we collect it here, and I think it might be quite useful in making decisions about how we treat our roads and pavements throughout the northeast.
Yep, thanks for that. Yes, there is information collated. Both local authorities, actually Murray are involved in the Road Safety Casualty Reduction Partnership as well. So the three local authorities bring together data and things like a really detailed look at monthly statistics is done and reported to local authorities. There's detail around time of day that accidents happen. And I know Kelly has done a piece of work, particularly over the winter months, about pedestrian casualties because they peak in November, December, January. Get About has had a major campaign on this winter in partnership with the Road Safety North East Scotland under the banner of Be Bright at Night to try and encourage pedestrians to be visible, but also to encourage drivers to make sure that they're looking out for people on the road. So yes, there's almost limitless information available. I'm sure we could pull something together if that would be of interest. But you know, local authorities tend to report it rather than we're doing the high level figures in this report. And the second part of your question, do we know what that costs? I think technically there is a factor which is put through the system of how much a fatal accident, a serious accident, and an injury accident costs community, society as a whole. And that's very much used in the assessment and appraisal when there's investment in road safety measures.
Okay, I did see Kelly's hand up. Did you want to come back in?
I was just to echo what Rab was saying about Be Bright at Night, and I do have lots of information and data on that, so which I can easily provide for you, all the trend data broken down into months and from the city and Aberdeenshire and Moray as well. So we've got lots of data. We don't know the causation factors of them all, but we have a gist and we know the time of night, and we do think that some of them are definitely linked with the change in the clocks going back at the end of October and the darker nights. Rather than the condition of the roads, it seems to be that, but I'm not saying the condition of the roads isn't a factor, but certainly we think it's more to do with the longer nights and shorter days.
I'd be really interested to see that, whether it's formally or just circulated. And it's particular winter maintenance that interests me, but we'll maybe pull it out from that.
Yeah, I did a presentation for the Road Safety Hour for Scorsa in December, so I've actually got a presentation sitting ready that I could just email you.
Yeah, sorry. John, do you want to come back in on that, or is it something else?
Yeah, it's just that there are Department of Transport and Transport Scotland monetised figures which encompass everything from emergency service and hospital response, as well as administration, insurance, damage to property, as well as also pain, grief and suffering. I think the most recent figures are just over £2 million for every single death on Britain's roads, £237,000 for every serious injury, and £18,000 for a slight injury. So monetising the figures that Rav's spoken about, it does, sadly, despite all the progress, it does harm the economy as well as obviously people's lives hugely.
But just cars, not pedestrians.
That's the economic harm to society by every road injury.
Can we back on this?
Thanks, Chair. It's just to note that a lot of these figures and the high-level trends are included in the Aberdeenshire Council Road Safety Plan, so I can share that with Nestrans Board as well as our own members again.
Okay, that'd be great. Councillor Blake.
Thank you, convener. I was interested in the report said that only 20% of the bus users were very satisfied with fares, which I'm not sure, we're not that surprised. But do we do any benchmarking of fares against other city regions as well?
Yeah, thanks for that. We do some benchmarking. In fact, the information that's in front of you is taken from Passenger Focus's national survey. So we have in the past put some funding in and get a larger number of surveys done in the Northeast, just to make sure that we can then split the information and get reliable data across Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire, for example. But that is a national document which can be compared, so we can do city to city. The information is a little bit out of date, and that is now 2019 is the most up to date. From memory, I think users in Aberdeen are slightly less satisfied than the rest of the country. And we've used that in the past. There's a discussion and a debate with our operators through the Bus Alliance. But I don't think it was, I don't want to say significant because that's a statistical definition, but I think it was marginally less satisfied in Aberdeen from memory. We also look at very satisfied and satisfied as two elements, and I should probably emphasize that anyone who's on a concession card doesn't get asked that question, because obviously people traveling for free tend to think of fares are great value. But yeah, they only ask that question of fare paying passengers.
Okay, thank you. Isabel, is that following on or not? No. Okay, Glenn.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I'm interested in the this access for all at Northeast railway stations. So the aim is great to ensure all passengers have step-free access to platforms, railway stations, etc. But I think our targets are really quite, well, in my opinion, are not high enough. So we're looking for by 2030, we're looking for 9 of our stations to be completely accessible out of 11. That's 7 years away. I think we need to relook at this. I mean, personally, since I've been a councillor, there's been lots of issues at Inch. I know there is a bit of movement now, but that's 6 years that people haven't had no. If you've got a mobility issue or if you're disabled, you can't use Inch Station, and that's one of the things we're wanting to get. We're wanting to get people into that transport, and for us to make so little progress in that time, well, not us, but partners. So I mean, we may end up by 2030 only having 9 out of 11, but I think the target should be higher. We should, in 7 years' time, they should all be accessible.
Yeah, I certainly sympathise. We've been looking at Inch Station for maybe 6 years on that issue, and we started with a position where Transport Scotland, Network Rail, ScotRail almost sent us, but hardly anybody uses Inch. It took us a long time to make that progress, appoint consultants, and go through a process whereby they accepted a report. But even that report having been accepted, I think now 18 months ago or so, there's been no funding, there's no bridge at Inch. So we keep pushing away on that one. But just the experience of having been through that Inch question, I think does make us realise that yes, we would like to be more ambitious. Kelly will remind me, but the bid to Department for Transport, who actually fund access to stations, Scotland gets a Barnett formula allocation from a decision that's made in London, and then gets a proportionate element from the number of stations. I think there are now 3 in the Northeast that are being put forward to that DFT proposal, but we await funding from UK government on the DFT position on how many they will fund across the UK, from which Scotland will then get a proportionate element.
Yeah, just to confirm, it's Inch, Stonehaven and Inverurie have all been put forward for the accessibility for all funding from the DFT.
Do we know, sorry, just jump in, do we know when we'll find out about this?
I think it's probably going to be in the next couple of months. I was told it'd probably be March.
Chair, if I may, just to say that the aim, baseline and target under each indicator was set by the previous board at its meeting at this time last year. So I haven't looked at it. I don't say I haven't looked at. I haven't proposed any changes to any of these, this being the first year that we've monitored it. But I think at some point, it would be valid for this board, the current board, to have a look at all of the targets and say, do we want to be more ambitious? The obvious one I touched on was things like reducing casualties. We're already at a figure lower than our target for road traffic collisions. And so you think, well, how can you possibly, Nestrans has a target to increase the number of road traffic collisions? Of course, that's not what we meant. But the target was set based on data, and I haven't at this stage suggested a revision of targets. I'm quite open if the board said to me, we should be reviewing them, or we should be reviewing them this time next year. I'm quite happy to have a look at that.
Just jump back, I'd be happy to review it. I don't know whether other members would be.
Yeah, maybe it is time to start reviewing them. Okay. Okay, I don't see any other questions. So we'll go to the recommendation. Note the content of this report and the RTS monitoring report attached as Appendix A. Okay, we'll move on to 4.3, Strategic Transport and Land Use Planning Policy Update, and that'd be Paul Finch.
Thank you very much, Chair. This is just a brief report closing off on the report I did this time last year, actually on consultation on the Strategic Transport Projects Review, the second one of those, and the National Planning Framework. Both of those documents have now been completed and adopted by the Transport Scotland and the Scottish Government. So this brief report just confirms what's in them. On the Strategic Transport Projects Review, the Transport Scotland didn't really make any changes significantly from the consultation draft to the final draft. There are some implications for the North East of Scotland from what's in the Strategic Transport Projects Review around, as we've previously discussed, the Aberdeen Rapid Transit proposals, strong commitment to active travel, physicals. There is a line in there about improving physical accessibility at rail stations, as we just discussed, although no specific schemes were detailed within the recommendation. The rail service improvements to Dundee and the Central Belt are included. Relative mentions about ferry services, but also you can see that some of the nationwide interventions do have implications for the North East around school travel, active travel, 20-mile zones, etc. So some of the elements around freight. One element that wasn't included in STPR2, which we were hoping was the corridor up via Ellen, Peterhead and Fraserburgh, although the document does say that regional and local bodies can still take forward that work and present the benefits and costs of that as part of the process that Transport Scotland consider for business cases as well. And some of that work is ongoing for the City Region deal on that corridor at the moment. Just over the page, we talk about the National Planning Framework 4 and a brief update on local development plans. The revised National Planning Framework was approved by the Scottish Government and it's now been adopted. It was adopted on the 13th of February. It's now part of the Statutory Development Plan. Key elements of NPF4, again, working with our regional transport strategy, working with the national transport documents, an emphasis on local living, compact urban growth and rural revitalisation. There are 18 national developments, again, urban mass transit systems in Aberdeen are mentioned, national walking, cycling and wheeling network is mentioned, the Aberdeen Harbour expansion is mentioned, also industrial green transition zones, which sort of stretch from Fife up to Peterhead and Fraserburgh, from what I could work out on there as well. With the NPF4 adoption, the former Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Plan no longer forms part of the Statutory Development Plan, and in the future there is provision for the development of voluntary, non-statutory regional spatial strategies within the approved planning framework, and we would anticipate that Nestrans would be involved in that work. On the local development plans, the Aberdeenshire Local Development Plan has now been formally adopted and approved by the Scottish Ministers. The Aberdeen City Council local development plan has been that the council has minded to approve it. I'm not sure I've got the right wording there, but again, it's pending final approval from Scottish ministers, and that currently is still pending their sign off. So just a recommendation to note the publication of Transport Scotland's STPR2 suite of documents, and also the publication of Scottish Government's National Planning Framework 4 and some of the implications arising from that. Thank you very much, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Paul, for that. I did see Isabel's hand. No, it's okay. Councillor Blake.
Thank you, convener. There was just two questions, and maybe they'd be suitable somewhere else, but I just wanted to be clear, the active cycle freeways, those will be as part of the corridor studies that we've just been talking about, or would that be something separate? And then I also wanted to ask about the nationwide interventions. I have a number of schools, primary schools in my ward, where there's significant issues around traffic, around schools. And I was wondering, under the school active travel plans, would we be looking at the introduction of pilots of school street initiatives?
Okay, Chair, thank you very much, and thank you for the question. The first one is, the documents are at a national level, so they are national level policy recommendations for the network, providing context for the development of local and regional transport strategies. I think that's probably where you would sit it. At the moment, the Strategic Transport Projects Review, they say it's not a funded document, but they are talking about a delivery plan being published in the next couple of months, when Transport Scotland have worked out their fiscal and their financial outcomes. So at the moment, the status is it has a national recommendation, national policy recommendation, that is a policy position that is being taken forward by Transport Scotland officers and through cascading down to regional and local authorities. So I would anticipate that. So going this, so that's the context of it. And in terms of that national, the freeways and that national work, I think it's important for the regional local partners to establish what they believe are the strategic priorities and put them forward as the active travel freeway. So it's actually working locally and regionally for what we want, so it's not necessarily imposed by the national. So hopefully we can do there's a top-down policy saying this is a good idea, but hopefully from the regional and the local level, we can go back up and say these are the best schemes, the best corridors for these active travel freeways, so it all links up. So that's the cycle one. The next one is the school travel plans. I guess I would anticipate that through the development of Aberdeen City Council's local transport strategy, which they're doing at the moment, that would identify the local policy interventions and possibly projects around school travel plans and potential the safe street zones. There's a policy context for it there, but I guess it is for the local authorities who are the roads authority to say, this is a good idea, this is where I want to go forward, which probably falls within that context there. Does that answer the question? So there's a wider policy context for it, but I think the local and the regional have got to sort of work out what that means locally.
Colin.
Sorry, just a point for my own thoughts. So and this is generally just a bit about these cycle networks and the corridors. They're different things, aren't they? They're not the networks between different villages and towns, etc. And the corridors are these 5 main corridors that we've been talking about for years into the city centre. I mean, I suppose that the corridors could be part of that, but is that where we're going with that? Is that it's 2 different things, isn't it?
The corridors are priority parts of the network. The network is as a hierarchy with it, and I would have thought that the corridors form one of those highest levels of that hierarchy. But there is a network of secondary and tertiary routes that fit beneath that.
Ian.
Chair, just a comment on the date and 3.5. I think it's January 2023. Is that right?
So Ian Ross has just pointed out paragraph 3.5, I've inadvertently said 13th of January 2022 when it should have been 13th of January 2023, and perhaps that can be picked up in a minute.
Okay, I see no other questions. So we go for the to accept the recommendations 1 and 2 on page 74. That's okay. Thank you. Moving on to 5.1, Aberdeen Rapid Transport and Bus Partnership Fund update, and that's RAB.
Thanks, Chair. Obviously, we've had a good hour and a half on Aberdeen Rapid Transit already this afternoon, so I won't labour this point. But there were some elements that I wanted to bring to the board's attention within the public part of the meeting, and in particular some of the results of the market research that Emily included in her presentation, but I felt that really we should provide that as a paper for the full board in its entirety, and that obviously then means it's in the public domain as well. So Appendix A is the results of that market research that was summarised during the earlier presentation. I think in summary, I've written the words on my notes, pretty positive. It's not overwhelming, but I think 40% stating they would be either extremely likely or likely to change their travel behaviour if ART were implemented, I think is quite significant. And 81% stating that they thought ART would be good or maybe good for the city, I think is an endorsement, if not quite a resounding endorsement. There are a couple of other elements there. We wanted to update under section 6 on the wider bus partnership fund projects. There are actually 10 elements to this project, of which Nestrans are leading on 2, and we've tended to focus in reports to the board on those 2, the rapid transit and the market research elements. But there's a short update there on each of the corridor studies that are going on as well. And there is also the work under construction at South College Street, all of which collaboratively or collectively forms the Bus Partnership Fund. The board is recommended to note these updates and to note the intention. I think we've discussed it before, to arrange an officers meeting with Birmingham and Bristol to see how they're developing their rapid transit schemes. I think there's also been talk about, do we need to speak to Lothian buses to see how they operate the franchise partnership type question. So a number of things ongoing, but the report's there for members' information, but happy to take any questions. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thanks. Is there, yeah, Colin?
Thanks, Rob. Just on the table at the end with all the reports in it, can we get dates of conclusions and when we're expected to see reports on these? You know, there's a lot of currently progressing, in progress, etc., but nothing to say, well, very little to say when we're going to see these reports or when the outlines, the information that comes out of these are going to be progressed.
Yeah, some of them are being led, the majority of them are being led by Aberdeen City Council officers, although we do have client teams that include Nestrans. We've brought to this board where we've been leading on a work package or where we funded it, which has been some of the other elements around multimodal study corridors, but not necessarily all of them being in the Bus Partnership Fund. But yeah, it's something certainly we could look at, Colin, is to try and get you an update on these. Jenny, I'm looking to see whether there might be some of that in the progress report under item 7.
Brief updates there, but as you said, there's quite a lot that Nestrans are proposing to fund, and they're in the budget for next year, so they would be reported in full. And I think we've put it in the information bulletin when there has been City Council reports on previous stages of these studies. So it is maybe brought to board, but not in a substantive report if it's the City Council that have been reporting on the findings.
Okay, can we
I certainly take the underlying point from Colin, though it would have been really helpful to get a little bit more info on updates, progress, and particularly target dates. So I'll take that on board. Thanks.
Okay, can we bring David in on this?
Thanks, Chair. I just wanted to come in on the bus partnership element, the corridor studies. They are progressing at some speed, but I will note, just for the board's interest, that we have run into difficulties with Transport Scotland in terms of resources on their side to actually progress those studies. So I will endeavour through RAB to circulate some information about where those studies are. But I think you will note from that there are quite a number of them which have been sitting with Transport Scotland for several months now at this stage, which is impacting on the overall programme delivery. But as I say, I will circulate something through RAB for the committee.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bradley.
Thank you, Convener. Just on the point that Mr. Dunn just made around sort of delays in Transport Scotland, is there anything we can do as a Nestrans Board or through yourself, Rab, to highlight the issues that are being felt in the city and see if we can move some of this along a wee bit? I'm just aware that obviously the timescales are very long, and we are as keen as possible to progress this as soon as possible, and anything that we can do to speed up that process surely is helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know David has written to Transport Scotland, and I maybe bring in David to give a fuller answer. But yes, Transport Scotland have established this bus partnership fund, and I think it's fair to say I've had a recruitment issue around staffing to support that. So we're really dealing with 2 people, I think, at Transport Scotland, and they're really under the cosh in terms of the number of BPF schemes that are coming in from across the country. And I do think, in fairness, that they see us as being one of the key important ones, but whether they've got the resource to actually turn that around in the tiniest manner that we require, I think is a really valid point. But I'm sure David can elaborate on that.
Yeah, do you want to come back in, David?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, I think Rob has summarised it very well. We are dealing effectively with two officers in Transport Scotland, and to give you context, this is a £500 million national scheme. If you look across Transport Scotland in other areas, which probably have a smaller fund associated with them, they will have significantly more staff. There's also been significant changeover of staff in the period of the programme so far. I would just like to be very clear, though, Daniel Spencer and Amy Phillips, who many of you will know through other pieces of work, who are the two officers involved, have been excellent and are working incredibly well and incredibly hard with our teams. But we have significantly more resource, even in the city, assigned to this project than Transport Scotland do. So if the board was minded to, perhaps a letter from the board to Transport Scotland, just sort of encouraging more resourcing. I realise they have probably the same resourcing challenges that we all have, but it seems a shame when the fund is there to be capitalised on, and the will seems to be there to deliver it, that something as relatively minor as some additional staffing resource from Transport Scotland could make a significant difference.
If I could come back in, I didn't ever mean to criticise any officers, especially at Transport Scotland. That wasn't my point. But David's words regarding, a letter would be, I think, beneficial at this point, because we are very keen to see this progress, if the board were so minded.
Okay, Rob, are you happy with it?
Yeah, happy to pull something together for your approval, Chair.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so we go to the recommendations 1 and 2 on page 80, and also add that we will look at putting a letter out as well. Right, we move on to 6.1, Park and Ride Annual Monitoring Report 22, and that is Adam, please.
Thank you, Chair. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm just going to talk you through the Park and Ride Annual Monitoring Report for 2022. So at Nestrans, we assess all of the Park and Ride sites in the North East. We class that as the 13 locations, which are your 5 base Park and Ride sites at Bridge of Don, Ellen, Kings Wells, Craveston and Newton Hill. And then the 8 railway stations, which act as rail-based Park and Ride sites, which are Huntley, Inch, Inverary, Kintore, Dice, Portlethen, Stonehaven and Lawrencekirk. Aberdeen is not included as that's seen as the destination in which you will arrive, so in theory that doesn't make it a Park and Ride site. So what we do is we go with a clipboard, very old fashioned, and count cars by manual count, and we did this during November. It was one of the things I did. I went out on my own on the train and went and counted cars, which was an interesting experience. And below in the chart, you will see the outcomes of each location and how they performed. Some clearly better than others. But what's the key takeaway is 384 cars are parked at bus-based Park and Ride sites, and 430 cars are parked at rail-based Park and Ride sites, meaning nearly a total of 800 cars per day are using the Park and Ride sites in the northeast of Scotland, contributing to reducing congestion, pollution, and necessitating space for parking within the city centre. So we quite like to use these figures to sort of get a rough picture of the annual picture that Park and Ride has. So for 2022, it is estimated that 762,000 trips were alleviated, with 360 trips being attributed to bus-based and 400,000 trips being attributed to rail-based. This data collection can then be used to assess the amount of car kilometres that are saved, with a total of 10.3 million car kilometres saved and 3.4 bus-based and 6.9 being rail-based. This then moves on to the environmental savings. So this can be broken down to understand how many emissions are being saved by reducing the amount of journeys that are happening along these corridors. 3,096 tonnes of CO2 equivalent was saved across both, with 176 tonnes and being attributed to bus-based and 2,920 tonnes being attributed to rail-based. Obviously, the rail-based is higher, significantly higher, due to the distances that journeys you're saving, such as Huntley and Inch, which are long distances in themselves. In terms of the capacity, we know the numbers of spots that are available at each site, and I think especially at the railway stations, we've seen healthy growth, but that's sort of come with issues of overcapacity, because at Dice and Stonehaven, we have 102% capacity at Dice and 110% at Stonehaven, and this should be noted by the board. The beauty of the method we use allows us to assess our performance against year-on-year basis, going back to 2015 when we have data for. But then also to think about the COVID impact, we can look at the 2020 data and see how that compares. And if you see the two graphs which are provided, you can see that there's a good performance growth from the 2020 count. To look at them individually, you can see that for bus-based park and ride sites, Ellen and Kings Wales are the strongest performers, with Ellen making a strong recovery against the 2019 levels and Kings Wales reaching levels which exceed their 2015 baseline by 125%. Other sites have seen some struggling factors, which you may be aware of, because some of the buses aren't using these sites anymore in the frequency that it did, such as with Bridge of Don, where there used to be quite a good service, but that doesn't exist to the same capacity these days. In terms of the rail-based park and ride sites, we've seen quite a good recovery as well, but it should be noted that Kintore has opened since the pandemic, and we are slowly beginning to see the benefit that has to the communities in the northeast. Moving on to Ellen Park and Ride, it's obviously a very important park and ride site for Aberdeenshire and residents north of Ellen and Fraserburgh and Peterhead. And there's been good investment which has been picked up by the Scottish Local Authority News. And this article was included as part of Appendix A, but unfortunately it seems to have corrupted. So I'm welcome to share it with members if they do wish to see a copy of it. Moving on to the importance of park and ride, it's important for a number of reasons for us at Nestrans. Most recently, it was in our regional transport strategy, Nestrans 2040, and it features in the vision for ART, which we've been discussing about today, with it being anchored off the park and ride site. It's also mentioned in the bus action plan and features in national and regional policy decision making. And detail of this is included in the report. And I think it's important to pick up on the final element, which is 29% of the population live outside large settlements in the northeast of Scotland, and it's important that we accommodate and make travel available for them all in as convenient way as we can do. Moving on to our final section, which is the future of park and ride sites in the northeast of Scotland. It's important that all partners continue to investigate the future of park and ride in the northeast of Scotland, because it's very important to our transport strategy. Thinking about the new site that was mentioned at Portlethen regarding the vision for ART, we could think about how it could be used in a more modern and pragmatic fashion, thinking about using it for electric charging. So we're exploring the idea of a Stirling. At Stirling, they have a low carbon hub, which allows you to charge your car while you do your business. And but as part of this, it's important to have the facilities available in order to get a hot drink or go to the toilet or do what you need to do. And so that could be quite useful, both rapid charging and electric charging to make park and ride a more viable and attractive option. So the board is recommended to note the contents of this report and the importance of park and ride sites to the northeast of Scotland, investigate the future of Park and Ride and how to see improvements at all sites in the northeast of Scotland, and investigate the potential for low carbon hubs as an alternative to conventional Park and Ride sites, with a possible synergy with the vision for ART and a new site at Port Lethen. Thank you, and we will do the best to answer all your questions.
Okay, thank you. Can I bring Isabel in, please?
Thank you very much for that. I think it's really interesting, the changes over time, for the park and rides. And I just wondered, I heard on the radio this morning, Craveston obviously is poorly used because there's no buses going there. So that seems to would very likely to have the biggest impact on it. If there's no buses, there's not going to be much traffic using it. But what about Bridge of Dawn? It did used to be a busy park and ride, and I guess with the AECC moving out, that might have had an impact, and Ellen maybe has had an impact as well. But do you know what the biggest impact on the Bridge of Dawn Park and Ride is, and why it's not used like it once was?
I'll try and pick that one up in the first instance. Yeah, when it was first introduced, it was quite a popular site, definitely. It was done at the time that the bus lanes were implemented on King Street corridor. And I think buses were seen as being quite competitive in a journey time aspect. They haven't really been built on, the bus priorities on that section. And over time, there have been a number of significant changes. So originally you used to pay for the car parking and the bus was free. That was changed over by the operator to a system that they felt was less likely to be abused, I think was the thinking at the time. Obviously, the vehicles maybe declined as they got older, and increasingly first started to operate that site as a call-in stop on the service that now serves the Bridge of Dawn. And I think over time they've realised that the majority of their custom was coming from Bridge of Dawn, some of whom were driving to that site, so not really the primary purpose of Park and Ride. And there's been changes around the operation on that basis. The council closed the waiting facilities at some point in the history of that site. So the facilities there are minimal now. And when we surveyed it this year, there were, I think, only 10 or 11 cars on the site. So yeah, there's a lot of lessons there, I think. And if we want a successful park and ride, about the elements that we need to think to make it operate effectively. But at the end of the day, it's got to be something that provides a choice that users want to use. It has to be competitive price-wise to the cost of driving and parking. And it has to offer a service which is reliable, clean, effective, and probably is, again, competitive in a journey time as well. So we believe, and I think Adam said it, that our strategy commits to park and ride as an important element to make sure that people who want to access the city centre in particular, but from further afield, have an opportunity that they can do so, but it has to be a product that people want to use.
Councillor Blake.
Thank you, convener. I have a couple of questions. I was really interested to see the large proportion for Kingswells, but when I visit that park and ride, it does seem very empty. And so I was wondering, what is the capacity? This report didn't really give me that indication of the capacity against the amount of people using it. What's the level of utilisation? And also on that point, do we know what the proportion of users who are actually from Kingswells? Because Kingswells doesn't really have a bus service. So my impression from my constituents is a lot of people drive down and then get the bus. From that, do we have any indication of that? And we also, I think you've just touched on that about services. I get quite a lot of inquiries from my constituents about the park and ride, about things like it's not open, the waiting room's not open at the weekends, it's not open in the evenings, there's issues with antisocial behaviour. So there are a number of issues around there, and so those were was my questions. I also have another point about the low carbon hub, but I'll ask the questions first and then come back.
Yep, thanks. Printed off all my data in case I got a question like this, and I've printed it so small I almost can't read it. However, I took my glasses off, and Kingswells has a capacity of 915. So just less than a third full on the days that we've done the survey. I was actually around at the time when we made the bid to Transport Scotland for funding for that Kingswells Park and Ride site. I think you were as well, Maggie. And it was a bid to Transport Scotland for funding, and we felt, let's aim high and get as much funding as we possibly can. And it maybe backfired a little because there is a perception out there that it's not well used, and yet when we look at the data, I think it's more than any of the railway station car parks, for example. We also know that Kingswells is used by a number of people who drop off, who aren't included in our survey because we're only counting cars parked. But I know certainly some of the kids coming into private school, for example, are dropped by parents and collected there. So we know there is more usage of park and ride, but what we're giving you today is really the number of cars parked rather than a full assessment of park and ride. I think that you ask an interesting question about, do we know who's using the sites? Not through this analysis, but again, it's maybe something, if we're thinking park and ride is a key part of our analysis going forward, maybe we need a little bit more information, and I guess some sort of work on surveying users might be beneficial. It was done in the past for Bridge of Dawn, but I guess a good number of years ago now, it was used, I think, to justify the bid for the Kingswell site. It was that long ago, but certainly something that we could look into, whether that would be a piece of work that would be worth undertaking. Don't know if that answered all your questions, but I haven't written them all down, so apologies if...
I think that answered all my questions. Yes, so there was the question around antisocial behaviour and facilities and things like that, because that definitely is something I get quite a lot of inquiries about, especially actually about it not being open in the evenings or weekends. A lot of elderly people use from the bottom of the village, use the park and ride, and yeah, they often make comments about the fact it's not open.
Again, a site that used to be open, that was operated by the City Council. I think there was a cost saving measure at some point many years ago. And I think from memory, it's now opened by the bus operator, but it is still a council facility. So I may be wrong on that, but that's my understanding.
Could I just say something about the low carbon hub idea? I think that's really brilliant idea. I have an electric car, and we drove down to the south of England at Christmas, and I spent an hour, well, I spent several hours charging, obviously, but we spent an hour at a Shell hub near Cambridge, and there was literally like the shop in the petrol station and nothing else. So I think I think it is really important that if we are going to do that, that it's important to put in facilities that people can use while they're waiting, because you are waiting. Well, obviously electric cars are getting better at charging, but certainly with our car, you're waiting for an hour at least to charge. So you do need something there while you're doing that.
Okay, thank you. Glenn.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. My question is really around Craveston. I take the point that the buses no longer service it, but they don't service it for a reason. It was never really used. I live in Kintour. The bus used to go around there all the time, and the most I ever counted was 10 cars. It is a huge, huge facility that just isn't like, it's like a white elephant, and it's never been successful as far as I know. So Obviously, ART is looking at utilising it as one of the venues, but we're going to have some time from now until ART is rolled out. So what are we going to do to actually, to improve this? 4 cars a day is fairly shocking. It needs to be part of our strategic thinking. We can't just have a report next year that says there's 3 or there's 5, and just go on year after year. We need, well, in my opinion, we need to start actually looking at these ones that are not performing well, examine the ones that are performing well, learn some lessons and do something about this. Because I have had for years people asking me, what a waste of money. Why are what are they doing with it? How can they improve it? And I never get any feedback. So hence the question.
Yeah, I mean, maybe something we could look into. As you say, it was a major investment. There'll probably lessons learned about how that was done. But at the end of the day, it's a commercial bus operator or 2 commercial bus operators, and we weren't in a position to force them to use that site. They felt there was more opportunity in serving the airport, TECA, and then straight into town. And without the bus priority to make a service that was viable and a competitive journey time, they didn't feel that they could justify taking extra time out of their routing to visit a site. And it was a little bit of, what comes first, the chicken or the egg, in that when there was no service there was obviously no demand, and vice versa. Through Nestrans, we did a bit of work about promoting and making that site more aware. We established a website, for example, which is about park and ride opportunities in the Northeast, because there wasn't that previously. But yeah, by that time it was too late to stop the bus being withdrawn by a commercial operator who wasn't prepared to make a loss until he built up custom to make it a viable ongoing feature of the transport network. But yeah, take your point, absolutely. Can we look at what we might be able to do to influence that and make that site more viable?
So if I could just jump back in, I mean, in that time, we've seen like another park and ride for the airport be built. And a section of that could have been utilised for that. We've seen TECA get built. Something could have been done there. I know there was a fantastic building that was demolished to make way for a car park, and yet we have this thing that's sitting there as well. So it's what can we do to utilise that? I mean, I'd be very interested, because for it just to sit there is a crying shame, and it's a waste of public funds.
Okay, Maggie, you want to come in with this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the Crabeston one, which I was around with when it was commissioned, was also partly related to the major development housing allocations out that way. And I suppose they've not yet come to fruition, and David might want to say something about that. But, there is a lot of housing allocated for it that way, and perhaps when that's built, that'll help add to the market. And also to come back on Councillor Radley's point a little bit, Councillor Blake, about what we might be able to, what facilities we might be able to provide at the park and ride sites to make them a bit more attractive. We are constrained a bit by the compulsory purchase orders, which I think say that they can only be used for park and rides reasons. We've certainly looked at that in the past, particularly around the Kingswell site, and it's actually quite difficult to justify putting in additional facilities that aren't obviously tied to the purpose of the site having been purchased for park and ride facility.
So, David, did you want to come in on this point as well?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Maggie's already said it, but absolutely, there's 4,500 houses pretty much on the opposite side of the road from that park and ride facility, which one would hope, once they are all completed, or once a significant additional numbers are completed, will provide additional use for the park and ride facility, assuming, of course, that there are services provided to operate on it. The other point that I would make, which is similar in context, is that there's a lot of planning permissions have been approved over the years for additional commercial facilities all along Dice Drive, not to mention the significant additional facilities that have been approved as part of the overall TECA master plan. So there was additional office development due to happen on those sites now. Fully accept that the when they are going to come forward, or how, or if indeed they're going to come forward, is another question. But I think there is a lot of development out there which, if it did happen, would significantly increase the profitability of routes on that corridor. And as I say, at the very least, as Maggie mentioned, the housing on the other side will have a significant impact.
Thank you, David. Right, Councillor Radley.
Thank you. I guess it's sort of on that point, and on a point that Councillor Blake made earlier. Have we had any conversations with the bus companies that are actually operating from these sites? I get the feeling that car parking, although is a measure, is maybe not capturing the full usage of the park and ride bus facility. And there are other people accessing this than just parking their cars, and whether that can be captured as part of this sort of ongoing review. That's my first bit of the question.
Yeah, I mean, you pick up a point I meant to emphasise actually, particularly in terms of the Kings Wells numbers, that there may be some parking overflow from Prime 4, for example. We try and identify that when we go out. You can almost tell by people who are parking close to the bus stop, and people who are parking at the furthest extreme from the bus stop because it's close to the in Business Park at Prime 4. So yes, we work very closely with the bus operators. They're obviously a little bit sensitive about commercial operations, so we wouldn't necessarily get information that we could publish, although we could speak to them certainly about what they would like to see, and we do speak to them about that, and what more we could do to encourage the use of park and ride. But probably we could get some data from them that would be usable as well and bring that back.
Even if it's not sort of commercially sensitive numbers, but we get an understanding of where the sort of bus patronage is coming from as well, that would be really helpful. My second question is around sort of recovery after the pandemic, because we've obviously got two graphs, and the bus-based park and ride and the rail station parking, and neither have quite reached the pre-pandemic levels of usage. What has been done to actively engage with people and let them know that these services are back up and running and available again?
Yeah, I mean, the bus operators were given support grant from government, which I think runs out at the end of March. We did talk about doing a sort of welcome back to the bus type campaign, but I think there were national campaigns in the end that were done, particularly on the rail side on that. I think just the number of people who are working from home, who are maybe not traveling as much as they once did, or are maybe traveling differently, is noticeable. I think the rail figures are almost back at where they were prior to 2019 figures, but not as high as 2018. So yeah, there's certainly still some potential for growth, and the bus one certainly is slightly down. We know that, and the bus operators are reporting that their figures are slightly down on pre-COVID numbers as well.
I guess I'm just wondering if there's an opportunity for Nestrans or the councils separately to come together and promote park and rides as an option, because we obviously have huge sites which aren't being fully utilised, but we've also got sort of a generation of people who entered the workforce during the pandemic. Maybe their habits have changed with regards to going to the office, and they're not aware of that as an option. And I just wonder if there's a piece of work which could be explored around that, and promoting this as an option, even to those who previously thought it wasn't, like pre-pandemic as well.
Yeah, certainly happy to take that away. As you know, let's think about what more we can do to promote and encourage, probably in partnership with the City Council and our colleagues and Aberdeenshire Council. I see Richard Mackenzie he's got his hand up, who's now going going to mention Ellen Park and Ride and the fact that it probably has been a little bit more successful. But Richard, if
Okay, Richard.
Chair.
Thank you, Chair. No, I wasn't going to actually mention that, but thanks, Rab, for saying that. No, I don't know how helpful it is. It wasn't actually strictly answering the question about the recovery on the bus-based park and ride, but certainly across the bus network, you know, that reflects the general patronage on the bus network's recovery. And just a bit of background information that although there's good recovery in the network now, it's mostly the concession passengers that aren't recovering, as in the elderly and the disabled. But the under 22 scheme is actually boosting the recovery. So at the young end of the scale, there's more than 100% recovery. But at the older generation like myself, it's less of a recovery. But more in terms of the answer is that it's our understanding that Transport Scotland is discussing with the Confederation of Passenger Transport in Scotland to do a big promotional campaign to try get a greater recovery on the bus network. And I think, you know, building on what Rab said, you know, there's the opportunity potentially in the Northeast for us to, once we see what's happening at a national level, to link into that, both in terms of the regional bus network, but also the park and ride network as part of that. So if that helps, Chair.
That's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I don't see any more questions. So if we can go to the recommendation, which is, I've lost it. Yes, recommendation is A, B and C on page 104. We're all happy with that, to agree that. And we will then move on to 6.2, active travel funding. And that's John, please.
Thank you. This paper is to provide board with an update on two significant funding streams for active travel projects, one which has been slightly changed in the context and one which is entirely new that have been announced, and to explain some of our plans for hopefully what this money can be used for. Firstly, the Regional Transport Partnership Active Travel Grant Fund. Members will be aware that in recent years there has been an increasing financial commitment from the Scottish Government to active travel projects, and in recent years as part of that, and it coincidentally came into being with me taking up post, Transport Scotland has provided Nestrans and the other RTPs with a standalone fund to help develop and deliver projects. And I've certainly made it my mission to revisit some of what you said earlier, to use this fund to help a combination of kickstart, reinvigorate and commence projects that have not been delivered yet. We've used the basis of our RTS, the respective LTSs and our active travel action plan to come up with what the projects are, and we've listed several there and say they're a combination of overdue projects and projects which have been accelerated, and indeed our own standalone projects. For the coming year, and it was touched upon earlier in the budget report, the Sustrans annual funding that comes to the grant that the post I occupy, they haven't spent this year, will be incorporated into the Transport Scotland Fund. And our bids for the coming financial year are all continuation of existing projects that we've got off the ground. The region-wide bike recycling and reuse scheme, the regional quiet route network signing, and building on what we've done to date around the core paths. The bids were put in December, and the amount we have requested this year is £600,000. The second one, as the name would suggest, is new. We got the invitation to submit applications just before Christmas, and it's entirely new funding over and above the additional funding that Transport Scotland has committed, or the Scottish Government have committed through Transport Scotland for active travel projects. It is intended for projects that are, to use a fairly worn out phrase now, shovel ready, or that could be delivered within the coming financial year, and to try and accelerate and stimulate some of the delays that we've spoken about earlier. Nestrans have, and the both councils have submitted bids. Our bids are threefold. The core path survey, there's a kind of duplication between the prior fund. Depending on what the outcome of the two bids are, we'll maximise as best we can between the two for the core path, so that hopefully we'll work towards, in the coming year, would be the hope that we can have, or the result will be we'll end up having all the core paths surveyed for the whole of the North East. The review and reassessment of our active travel action plan, which was published in December 2014, and building on something that Cycling Scotland have trialled in 2 local authorities, is the rollout of kind of some good cycle space signage, which builds on, as we said earlier, more people out using the roads on bikes. So we need to all do our bit to make it safer for them to do so. Deadline, excuse me, for that bids were just the end of January, and the amount we've requested is £500,000. Rab and I have already met with Transport Scotland around these, and we hope to hear as soon as possible, ideally before the end of this financial year, so that we can continue without a pause, and we can maximise the use of the money in the coming financial year, so that, just to take the point, as again it was said earlier, that we don't miss a step and we don't delay the delivery of some of these projects. And just to build on something that was said in the chamber earlier, the aim with both these funds is to ensure that we can help deliver the transformational change that is needed.
Okay, thanks, John, for that. Is there any questions? Colin.
Thank you. At a previous meeting, I can't remember if it was the last meeting or the meeting before, we had a brief outline of what our area was spending compared to other areas, and it was significantly lower than others. Is this the amount we're getting here? Is that a fair proportion of what we're getting out of Sustrans and out of the Scottish Government for this?
Through you, Chair. The best answer I can give to that is it's proved really difficult year upon year for a variety of reasons to spend anything we've got or anything we've received. Our bids have become increasingly ambitious and larger, so that we do get our slice of the cake, for want of a better description. The latter fund has a ceiling, so it's £25 million. So it was that balance between what could we physically deliver, or what do we think we could physically deliver, with a very tight timescale for the second fund, and the competing demands of existing council priorities and actions, and as mentioned upon earlier, the limited resource and plans that are already happening. What could we physically think we could do? If we get a win-win on both funds, do we think we can deliver all this? Yes, is the short answer.
Councillor Blake.
Thank you. So we talked about in one of the previous papers about delays, and we're waiting for things from Transport Scotland. Does that mean, has that stopped us bidding for some additional money under these, that because we're not sure when those things will come back from Transport Scotland? Do those delays has impacted on what we can bid for here?
Through you, Chair. From my perspective, not at all. There's been no delay or no inconsistency from Transport Scotland. I could probably best sum my answer by saying we all need to do better locally to do more.
Okay, Councillor John Cox.
Just a quick question on, I know in the report there's no mention of the active travel bridge. Although we did receive funds, but is that the reason why it's not included here? Because we've already been awarded funds for the works to carry out the study on the Banff active bridge. Just want confirmation, please, so it hasn't dropped off.
Through the chair, no, it hasn't dropped off, Councillor Cox. It's been allocated through Surstrands Places for Everyone Fund. It is one of the downsides to the growth in active travel spending, is there are lots of doors with lots of money behind each of them. So there are lots of funding streams.
Thank you.
Councillor Blake.
Sorry, convener, just one more question. I know this may be just me not quite knowing. So it talks about the beginning, the network surveys of the core paths, and you mentioned that, John, but we were also talking about earlier about the environment of the 30K because we haven't had the Aberdeen core path asset management plan. So those two different projects that are going on, and they're not connected. John's nodding at me, so I'll take that as the answer. Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, John, for that report. I don't see any other questions, so we just go to the recommendation to accept on page 109. Note the contents of this report and the respective bids that Nestrans has made. Okay, thanks. We'll now move on to 7, which is progress reports, and I'll just open it up to any questions on that.
Yeah,
Colin.
I've made this point before, but reading through some of this and looking at the wee arrows at the side that are predominantly going upwards, it doesn't read the same. You know, we've got projects here that are being deferred into next year, but I've got arrows that are going up, and I would quite like if somebody was having a really good look at these things and actually questioning them before they come here, because you're reading through this and you're going, well, that's not right, because it's, we're not doing it in the timescale that we said we were a couple of meetings ago. And again, same point as earlier, if we have got targets of when we're supposed to do these, can we have the target dates and for these projects in these? I know you get these reports from the council sent through to them, but there's a bit missing in this report that just doesn't click with me.
Yeah, I mean, just to emphasise that we only highlight in here where there has been change since the last board meeting. So mostly it's where there has been progress, we report them. And I guess by definition, there's therefore likely to be a little up arrow or a down arrow, I should say. And where there hasn't been change, I think they're left out. I'm sure Jenny can give an awful lot better explanation of that than I can, though.
Just to give my apologies, because I do it and probably the arrows aren't always, I'm so busy updating the text that I maybe don't pay attention to the arrows. And sometimes it's debatable because I've maybe noted that a project is carrying on next year, but the construction, if it is due to happen in May, I still see it as being progress, but you might see that as being a down arrow because it's not happened before the end of March. So maybe some of them could be argued in their presentation.
For some of these projects, do we have actual dates of when they're initially instigated, when we're expecting these things to be finished, so that we have an idea of what's there? Because I mean, there's one or two, but there's quite a few of these that have rolled on since I've been on the board, and just gone, yeah, it's going into next year, and it's going into next year, and at the end of one year into another. So it's quite confusing to see where there is progress and what's been happening, what's just stagnating, really.
I would hope that the text can explain if there are delays, you know, if it's been a land purchase or a staff resource or whatever. But generally work's been done to try and progress it. But hopefully the text always gives that ongoing current status of where each project's at.
Yes, Councillor Blake.
Thank you. I was looking at the one about core paths improvements to Aberdeen, and it may be I was interested in, so it's talking here about the ones around Seaton Park, but I was interested in about core path 57, which was shut for well over a year after Storm Arwen. I believe it's been reopened recently, but that the state of the path is pretty bad. So I'm just looking at that. Do we know where core path 57 is on that? That's probably a question for David Dunn, I suspect.
Yes, sorry, David.
Thanks, Chair, and thank you, Councillor Blake, for that very helpful question. I don't. I will endeavour to find that information for you and get it back. I will say, as you rightly mentioned, the team did have, and indeed a lot of the environmental services teams still do have a huge amount of work post Storm Arwen in terms of tree clearing, but I'll get some more information on that and the state of the path. I can say that there is work underway this year to look at the core paths plan for the city, and as part of that, obviously we'll be looking at the condition of all of the paths, but I'll get something for you on that.
Thank you, David. Don't see any other questions.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just on the core path 57. The tree was down in a section of core path that was within the gift of a private landowner. Although, so to kind of defend the council, the delay for the tree removal wasn't entirely within the council's gift because it was on private land, albeit the plans are underway to improve the access on either side of it.
Okay, Isabel.
Yeah, it was just really followed on from Colin's comments. I'm not sure what the outcome was, and I do think it would be good to have the anticipated date and then see if there's slippage or one way or the other, if it goes faster or slower. But without knowing, we see so many projects carried forward, but it's difficult to tell whether they're behind or whether the whole project's going to happen. So start dates and end dates would be really useful to properly monitor slippage, because I think it's up to us to be aware of where we're at and how we're spending funds and what progress we're making. And without that information, we're not in a position to do that. Or and maybe they could be ragged for that matter, so that we know what's going on better.
Yeah, we'll try and take these on board for future meetings. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so we will move on to item 8, which is publications and consultations, and that's Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. So there are 3 publications that I wanted to give some attention to. The first one is around the A96 corridor. As you'll all be aware, there are some proposals to dual the A96, and initial appraisal of options for this corridor have been undertaken. At the moment, there are 16 options going forward to be considered, and those outcomes are expected to be announced alongside a climate compatibility assessment in the first half of 2023. I have put a link into the report so you can go and have a look at what those options are, and also a public consultation on public opinion on that corridor is available on the Transport Scotland website at that link as well. I also wanted to update board on the Parking and Transport Scotland Act 2019. This is about putting in the statutory framework for local authorities to enforce double parking, ban of parking on pavements and parking at drop curbs. This is primarily around accessibility and encouraging walking and wheeling, so people who are in wheelchairs or pushing prams are not having to go onto the road because the pavements are being blocked by cars or the drop curves are being blocked by cars. There are some exemptions in terms of certain vehicles, obviously for emergencies, delivering goods for a temporary period and so on. There's also a clause in there around local authorities being able to share services with other councils, but also requiring local authorities to keep accounts in relation to the money they receive for the enforcement of these new restrictions. And lastly, it was to draw the board's attention to the Scottish Parliament's Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee, which published a report on the 23rd of January on the role of local government and its cross-sectoral partners in financing and delivering a net zero Scotland. And as you can see there, recommendation 15 on transport and active travel is very relevant to Nestrans and is basically supporting stronger regional transport partnership models to help enable positive behavioural change in terms of net zero. So the committee was basically emphasising the importance of regional transport partnerships, and we thought we would draw that to your attention. So the recommendations are just to note the publication of the A96 consultation and initial appraisal options, note the publication of the new parking framework, and to note the publication of the Net Zero Energy and Transport Committee report and its recommendations in regard to regional transport partnerships. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thanks for that, Kelly. I don't see any questions, so we'll go to approve the 3 recommendations on page 154, 1, 2, and 3. So we'll move on to the next one, which is information bulletin, and that is also Kelly.
Thank you, Chair. Again, the information bulletin is just to update the board on things that don't really require a decision, but we think it's useful for you to be aware. The first one is in terms of our Get About communications and marketing, and this will be of interest to Councillor Davidson in terms of the Be Bright at Night road safety campaign that we did over the festive period, which was very much used to promote road safety to drivers, pedestrians and cyclists. We did some digital advertising, which was the first time we'd done this. We did a homepage takeover of the Press and Journal website on Mad Friday, just before Christmas. And we did a number of social media adverts to promote the article, along with our usual radio adverts and bus shelter adverts and billboards and things that we would normally do. So we've put some numbers there in terms of impressions and the social media reach from that campaign. So that has been a really interesting campaign, and hopefully lots of people who perhaps don't see the more traditional advertising might have seen our messages on social media and online. There's some images there just so you can see the tips and what the articles were. We've given an update on the number of followers we have on our various social media channels, and just to inform the board that the Get About working group has a rotating chair, and this year for 2023 Aberdeenshire Council will be chairing the meetings, and we had our first working group meeting this morning, of which Aberdeenshire Council chaired. We've got Cycling Scotland's National Monitoring Framework has been published. There's just an overview of that on the report there, and there's also a link to the Cycling Open Data portal, which has got some really interesting information around our counters and surveys in different areas. We've got some information around modal shift there, total recorded journeys for the May and September surveys, which is interesting information. And again, I'm happy to go through and answer any questions on those.
Councillor Blake.
Thank you. I was wondering about the Be Bright at Night campaign. How you've given us the impressions, but I wasn't clear in the reach. But I wasn't clear how many click-throughs that you had to the winter safety tips. You know, because obviously you will have had a call to action in this. And so, what was you know, how many clicks did you get through, or how many followers did you gain from the campaign?
Oh, I'm not sure of the number of followers that we gained from our campaign. We know how many people viewed the article, which had the 13 road safety tips, how many click-throughs that we got through to the Get About website as a result of that. I know we do have that information, but I can't remember what that number is, but I can certainly get that for you. We were provided it from the Preston Journal, so we can get that information to you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions, so it's just for the board to note the contents of this report. And we will move on to item 10, conferences and presentations, and that would be RAB.
Thank you, Chair. Conferences and presentations is the list of activities that Nestrans will be undertaking or have recently undertaken in terms of conferences. So there's a number there for information. I don't think there are any financial implications of any of them, and it's just for noting at this stage. Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any questions there, so we move on to item 11, which is pending business and reports for further meetings by RAB.
Thanks, Chair. Pending business is an indication of future reports that we intend to bring to the board. There has been some talk and some discussion about the funding for recycle reuse scheme, and that's now making significant progress. And we thought it might be worth bringing a presentation to the April board meeting if we can get the operators to come along either in person or online and give us an indication of how that scheme is going. We would also intend bringing back reports, as we mentioned, on the rapid transit appraisal outcomes. And I'm sure we picked up on another one that I promised to bring back today, but I haven't got it in front of me just now. But happy to take any points from members if there are reports that are felt to be needed.
Okay, I don't see any hands, or so that would say that the board is to note the report on pending business. So that takes us to the end of the agenda. I'd like to thank all the officers and members for attending, and you'll be glad to know we're finishing a minute early. So thank you.